and welcome to the October 25th Board of Select Board meeting. It is 7 o'clock, and I would call this meeting to order and ask that we start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We will start this evening with any public comment. No takers? Okay. All right, so our first item on the agenda is our public hearing for the application of the storage of flammable and combustible liquid solids and gases at 1450 Osgood Street. So I will take a motion to move into the public hearing.
I will move to open the public hearing for the application for storage of flammable and combustible liquid solids and gases at 1450 Osgood Street.
I'll second that.
A motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. All right, we are in the public hearing. Do we have anybody here to present tonight? The floor is yours.
Good evening. My name is Paul DeLeo. I'm the owner of DeLeo Gas. We'll be the one that is going to be installing the propane tanks over at 1450 Osgood Road. As you guys well know, that is the Amazon project that's going on. There's going to be two different tank farms. One tank farm is going to be 4 1,000-gallon tanks, and that's going to be for the concrete plant that's on site. And there's going to be 12 1,000-gallon tanks for the main building. The purpose of the propane storage is mostly for the concrete. Throughout the winter months to keep the project going. They're going to be needing hot water to feed the concrete to the building, and inside the building they're going to need to heat up sections of the building for when they pour the concrete. So we're here today for the flammable storage license to store that quantity on that property.
Thank you. We have favorable action from the fire, the police, the building department. Does anybody have any questions?
So is this just going to be temporary?
This is temporary,
They'll
correct,
be removed once the project is completed?
Yep. Throughout after the winter months, we'll be taking the tanks out of off the property. The goal is natural gas to come in. They were trying to use that throughout this winter month, but there's no guarantees that they can get the gas line to the building and to the concrete plant. So that's the reason why we're going with this option.
Makes sense.
And this is also going to be used to keep the foundation, the curing.
Yeah, exactly.
Warm
It's for the
enough so
curing.
it-
Yeah, so for the concrete plant, they'll be heating hot water while they're mixing the concrete, and as they're moving it to the building, they'll need the building to be a specific temperature also.
Temperature, yeah. Good. Anybody else? No? Thank you.
Yep.
I will take a motion to close the public hearing.
We just want to see if there's
Oh,
any public
sorry.
comments on it first.
Is there any public comment?
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ellen Keller. I'm the Vice President with Aussie Properties, and we represent 1600 Osgood Street, which is the closest to Butter. We obviously support the need for this, but we are curious about exactly where these propane tanks would be located. If the fire department is going to be overseeing their safe installation, and we want to ensure that it is in fact temporary, and whether or not that's a part of the license as opposed to any permanent installation. Thank you.
So based on the application, it does deem it to be a temporary license to store 16,000 gallons of propane at 2 separate locations on 1450 Osgood Street. If you look at the attachment, it does show, and on page 5, a map of where they will be located. The fire department does have conditions listed, and those conditions, I'm just flipping forward, state that the fire department is in favor of the application for the temporary storage of 16,000 gallons of propane located at 1450 Osgood Street. These tanks will be at 2 different locations on site, and all setbacks have been met. All storage and condition of use must be in accordance with NFPA 58, 527 CMR Chapter 69, and all applicable references, and will be enforced during the permitting process. And that is signed by Lieutenant Kilcoyne and Lieutenant Nussbaum from Fire Prevention.
Thank you. I appreciate that being read into the record. Thank you.
Is there any other other public comment? Thank you. Then I will take a motion to close the public hearing.
Madam Chair, I'll motion we close the public hearing.
I'll second that.
Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, we are out of the public hearing. So we're going to move on to governmental reports, and if it pleases the board, I'd like to take the watershed plan out of order so that our consultant can, I believe, head back to Rhode Island.
Don't we have to?
Madam Chair, do you want to move the vote for the flammable
Oh.
storage up, just so that they can
They can go home
go
too?
home too?
Madam Chair, I would move approval.
For the, we're going to take a vote on the combustible liquids at 1450 Osgood. I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second?
All those in favor?
So, Madam Chair, friendly
Okay.
amendment just to ensure that as the town manager read into the record, that all of the fire department's conditions are met
Okay.
and
Yep.
enforced for the permit.
I'll accept that friendly amendment.
Excellent. So we have a motion, a second, the amendment. All those in favor?
Aye.
That passes. Thank you. Okay, now we will move on to the watershed plan. Thank you. Have a good night.
Nice to see you, Ellen.
Can everyone hear, see me?
Yes.
Yes.
All good?
Great. So I will introduce the watershed plan while Jim's getting set up, unless he's already set up. So I'm Dan Begley, the staff planner. I helped oversee the development of the Lake Chickawick Watershed Management Plan update. This has been an intensive process covering a lot of ground, thanks to the hard work of Weston and Sampson engineers and a group of dedicated stakeholders. So at the meeting tonight, I know our Jim Reardon, who is the project lead from Weston and Sampson, Gene Enright, planning director, Andrew Shapiro, director of community and economic development, and I believe Peter Boynton is present as a representative of the planning board. And so we will just be going over the plan as it's in its final form. Jim, are you ready to move to slide 2?
Sure. Have it up right
Great. All right. So process started by sort of looking at past work. So the first watershed plan was completed in 1987 and initiated as a result of Giardia outbreaks, following up on related master plan goals in the present day, and also following instances of algal blooms in the lake. An updated plan was sought. So we contracted with Weston and Sampson to develop a watershed plan, and throughout the process, we worked with this group of internal stakeholders. So people from planning, conservation, health, Department of Public Works, the planning board, and the water department were all an integral part of this process, and really helped to bring insights from a bunch of different disciplines to help us better assess and determine future management of the lake. And I'll turn it over to Jim to talk a little bit more about the process.
So a little bit first about the status of the project, and I should introduce myself too. I'm Jim Reardon from Weston and Sampson, project manager and team leader there. So a little bit about the status of the project first. This has been an involved project. It started about this time last year. We're nearing completion of it now. We've put together a final draft watershed management plan, which, as Dan was mentioning, is an update to the original one that was developed in 1987. You know, in part, this had a number of phases to it, but in part, this took a look at the current status of the watershed, the existing water quality data, pulling all that together with education and outreach and engagement, and doing sampling in the watershed. We'll give you some more detail on that as we move along through this presentation. I'm sure you all know Lake Cochituic is the only source of water, drinking water for North Andover. It experiences algal blooms and has been for the last few years. It's got a watershed that's about 2,700 acres, which is a pretty good sized watershed. It's monitored regularly by the water department and has been for the last 2 or 3 decades. And as I mentioned earlier, the last comprehensive study was back in 1987. So it's been a little while since it was studied comprehensively, even though it is regularly monitored and assessed. Part of this project involved engagement. We did a number of elements of engagement as part of this study. It included video that was posted online, gives people sort of the lay of the land, good idea of what's going on in the watershed, and what a watershed study looks like, what it takes into account. Social media posts were included too to let folks know the status of the project as it was moving along, and when there were engagement opportunities such as public meetings, fact sheets that were available, online surveys, stakeholder meetings, etc. And so we've had a number of those sorts of things. Also, again, we use the web as much as possible, and virtual engagement given the conditions with the pandemic, of course. One of the first things that we did as we started this project was to evaluate existing data. And there's quite a treasure trove of existing data. The water department has been collecting data for years and years, as I mentioned, and there was the previous study that was done. There were some issues with the data that prevented us from doing a really complete assessment of that. But as part of the data that was collected, there's a thing called Secchi disk transparency. And that helps you assess the clarity of the water. Clarity is a really good measure of watershed health. You usually like to take that into account with some other things too, but even that by itself helps you get a pretty good understanding of what's going on. Because as the clarity improves, what that means is there's probably less plant growth in the lake, particularly microscopic plants like algae and things like that. They tend to occlude the water, make it difficult to see through, so the clarity falls off as you get more of that kind of growth and more of what's called chlorophyll A. We saw that clarity was actually improving quite a bit over the last 20 years. If you started back 20 years ago at about 2 meters of clarity, currently you can see sometimes down as far as 4 meters, 3.5, 4 meters, pretty consistently. As we got into sampling this summer, which we did sampling in July, August, and September of the lake and the tributaries around the lake. As we got into sampling, we saw that total phosphorus had dropped off quite a bit since the 1980s. So the blue line on top shows the summer months total phosphorus from 1986. The 1987 plan, of course, used data from before that, so it's 1986. And the red line down at the bottom shows the total phosphorus data that we collected over this summer. We weren't able to get on the lake into July, so that's why the red line doesn't extend in July. But you can see that there's quite a drop-off. And the numbers actually might be lower than what's shown in this chart because there's a detection limit and a reporting limit with phosphorus. And the laboratory told us that we had gotten to the detection limit. So these were no detects, so it could have been any place between 0 and 10 parts per billion. We take that as an average and just assume it's 5, someplace in between 0 and 10, of course. And that's what this graph represents. If you take so we looked at tributaries and we looked at at the at in-lake data as well. And around the lake, we saw that the tributaries had phosphorus. If you average the in-lake phosphorus and the tributary phosphorus, that there was a mean over this past summer of about 0.049 milligrams per liter. That's the same thing as parts per million or 49 parts per billion. You saw in 1986 the average was more like 58 parts per billion. But in the lake itself, as I mentioned, it dropped off quite a bit. So in 1986, the average in lake during the summer of 1986 was 23 parts per billion. And again, that actually dropped down for our measurements to 5 parts per billion. So nice drop off, less phosphorus is better. That means there's less plant growth, the clarity's improved, less chlorophyll A, less algae, all those sorts of things. Those are all improvements. So this is actually a slide depicting also the total phosphorus data, but pointing out that there were a couple of tributaries, there are a couple of areas within the watershed where there appear to be some problems. And so that includes Foamy Brook and Country Club Brook. In those areas where we sampled this year, we saw some constituents of concern that were at higher levels. So one of the things recommended in this plan is to take a closer look at that in the watershed, probably do some field work and try and identify what's going on in those areas. One of the things that we did as part of this study was modeling. So we modeled the water quality. And the reason why we modeled the water quality is because we wanted to be able to predict what would happen if there were changes in land use around the watershed, and what might also happen if you installed best management practices, particularly for stormwater management, to try and reduce the amount of phosphorus. And so we took the existing data and we looked from 1985, what the land use data was, and currently what the land use data is, or as close as we could get. And we put those numbers into the model, and we compared that to the actual data that we had to get a good sense of whether the model was well calibrated or not. That's pretty much the way you do that. And this is what we found. So this table represents, in the middle columns, the modeling years, and we looked at, so land use data is only redone every few years. We were able to find data from 1985, pretty close to 1986, so not a lot of changes in land use we wouldn't expect then, and 2016 was the most recent. And so we compared that to sampling data from 2015. That was the closest, that we could get, 2015 and 2016, only a year apart, and 1986 and 1985. So sampling data from 1986, land use from 1985, sampling data from 2015, and modeling data from 2016. And you can see, particularly if you look down at the Secchi disk transparency data down at the bottom row, that there's pretty good agreement. Now, the numbers aren't exactly the same. You don't expect them to be, this is a model, models, aren't perfect. But you can see that there is a change that is on the same order of magnitude in the model as there was in the sampling year. And so that indicates pretty good agreement between the model and reality. And so now we can use this data to try and predict what would happen, with changes in land use and improvements using best management practices and things like that. So when we did that, we took a look at what it might be like if you installed stormwater best management practices throughout the entire watershed. Every place you could put them, every place you could reasonably put them, you tuck in some best management practices. We designed them conceptually, so you know, it's a fairly inexpensive exercise in terms of BMP design, and figured out what size they ought to be and what they might cost if they were that size. And we found that it would be pretty darn expensive to put stormwater BMPs throughout the watershed. You might have already guessed this, but it would be quite expensive. We found numbers someplace between 9 million and about 19 million. At the conceptual level of design, that's about as accurate as you can get. And unfortunately, all you were going to get in improvement for that was someplace between 1 and 4 parts per billion, according to the model. So that's not like a really significant improvement, of course. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try this out in some smaller way, see if we can get, you know, better results by actually trying it out than we can in the model. So what we recommended in conjunction with the folks on the steering committee, on the working group, was to identify one subbasin, and we did. We picked the smallest subbasin we could, subbasin number 7, that was right up next close to the lake. Actually has a fair amount of impervious surface, so there's a lot of stormwater that comes off of this. And recommended potentially installing sand filter, which you can see here. And these are catch basin inserts. So you'll notice that the sand filter is right along the road. So most people think of sand filters as being surface things, but like this, but you can actually install them subsurface. Like here's an example of a place where a sand filter is installed. It's right underneath that parking area. You can do this in roadways too, or at least along the sides of roadways and things like that. So you can get the benefit of the sand filter without having, you know, this thing on the surface that's ugly and in the way of your cars when you're trying to drive. Catch basin inserts, as you might imagine, go straight into the catch basin. This upside down witch's hat looking thing is catch basin insert. The sort of sump or bag in the middle of it is where most of the sediment gathers. This is a filter fabric. When you capture sediment, you also capture phosphorus because the phosphorus tends to adhere to the sediment. So these are good strategies for getting rid of phosphorus. Sand filter is one of the best BMPs that you can get for getting rid of dissolved phosphorus, which is the phosphorus that isn't adhered to the sediment. In combination, in the area that I showed you guys a couple of moments ago, subbasin 7, that all those BMPs would probably be about $750,000. So quite a bit less than the, you know, 9 million or 19 million. Plus, we think that it's the sort of thing that you can probably get grant funding for. So grant funding for water quality projects like the kind of thing that we're talking about here, you can usually get grants in the amount of about 75% match and about the amount of 25%. They go up and down a little bit, but you know, for about $250,000, you can try out something like this and see if it works pretty well. Okay, at this point, we're going to talk about other actions that are in the watershed plan, and I'm going to refer back to Dan and let him talk about the first few items here in the action plan, so the source controls.
Thanks, Jim. So the action plan takes all the recommendations from the watershed plan and outlines them in an actionable way. And this spans a lot of different regulatory jurisdictions and types of practices of concern. And one of the best and most cost-effective ways of protecting your watershed and the drinking water in it is controlling any sources of pollutants. We're not going to cover all of the action plan tonight, but these are certainly some of the important highlights. And one that I'd especially like to point out is an idea that came out of this process was the possibility to direct dog walkers who are going to Weir Hill from the Pleasant Street parking lot near the National Grid substation, directing them to the Weir Hill parking lot on Stevens Street. Starting in Pleasant Street, dog walkers quickly enter the watershed And pet waste was identified as a major source of pollutants in the watershed, both for pathogens and other pollutants. And this came up a lot in our public participation processes as well, as people have observed this on the trails. And so thinking about this, there's the opportunity to start walking your dog also at Weir Hill, just from a different point, starting outside of the watershed, and it's about a quarter to a half mile up the trails before you enter the watershed if you're starting from Stevens Street. And so this is something that was discussed a lot and requires further discussion, but we are especially looking to leadership of the town to sort of inform best ways to sort of encourage good behaviors around this, as it's certainly something that could either be regulated or just something that could be marketed as a desirable behavior. Some more straightforward proposals include utilizing existing resources to enforce existing solid waste management regulations. A long time ago, I think about 2001, it was recommended that we continue to in the future revisit a discussion with Brooks School about their gasoline-powered boats. So that's brought up again in this plan as something that we should continue to have that discussion or revive that discussion. There's also opportunities to consider alternatives to conventional road salt, as we have a lot of roads that not only go through the watershed but are right up against the lake. And educating the public about source controls is also a major part. So there's opportunities to let new homeowners know that they live in the watershed and what they do is affecting the drinking water, as well as working with people who work in the watershed, like landscapers, to help reduce fertilizers that have phosphorus in them and are likely to leach into the lake. And so moving on from source controls, I'm going to quickly turn it back over to Jim to speak a little bit about policy and infrastructure.
Sure. So then one of the things that was recommended as part of this plan, and one of the things that we were hired to do, was take a look at existing policy and do an assessment of what might be improved. The major point that came out of that was to improve the clarity of some of the local standards, particularly the development standards in the Watershed Protection District. And the town actually worked on that while we were developing other parts of the watershed plan and doing the project. So those updates have been completed in the process of doing this. It's nice to have an action item that's already been implemented when you're introducing a plan. Infrastructure improvements. So we talked about stormwater a few slides back. This is, of course, one of the action items in the plan. What we're recommending is stormwater improvements in the Subbasin 7 that we mentioned, that the town set aside $250,000 and seek grants for the remaining funds. This is, we think that there are a good number of grants that are out there that could be used for this sort of work. Land acquisition. So one of the best ways that you can protect your lake is by acquiring sort of a protective barrier around the lake, a buffer strip, if you will, or a buffer area, if you will, where the land is kept in, essentially undeveloped condition. So one of the things that we would recommend doing is looking around the watershed, identifying lands that you might want to acquire, sort of in a similar fashion that Mass Department of Conservation and Recreation does for their watersheds around their lakes or their drinking water supplies, and using GIS and other tools like that, come up with a prioritization scheme and identify which land you might like to purchase first. In order to purchase the land, of course, you need money. So one tool that has been used, and this is actually something that is, from just south of you in Rhode Island, is a watershed protection fee that's based on a fee that's charged, a service fee that's charged on top of the normal drinking water supply fee. So in Rhode Island, they call it the penny per 100 program, which refers to 1 penny per 100 gallons being charged, you know, in addition to what the normal fee is. That money is then collected in a restricted receipt account, and the money is dedicated to the use of watershed protection. In the case of, you know, what we're talking about here, it could be just for acquiring land that would help to protect the drinking water supply. You know, a penny per 100 may not generate enough money, but, you know, a little bit more than that, maybe a nickel per 100 or a dime per 100 would make a big difference. And it's not a lot of money that we're talking about annually for a household. It's probably 30 or 40 bucks, somewhere in that neighborhood. Action plan financing. So we talked about one method to finance just a moment ago there. A couple of them, actually. We also mentioned grants as a potential source, fees as a potential source. Certainly you can use your general fund or pass bonds. These are all ways that as a town, you can acquire the funds that you need to do some of the action items that you might like to do, you know, where they're more expensive. Action plan monitoring and modeling. So updating water quality sampling schedule procedures recommended for the treatment plant. This is something that was included in the plan. That using this information as a way to understand what's going on with the watershed and potentially doing future studies with you know, outside contractors like limnologists, those are like scientists essentially, to do assessments and get a better sense of what's going on in the water body and the watershed are something that is important to your understanding of the lake. So you want to collect data, but you want to assess that on a regular basis internally, but occasionally you probably want an outside expert to help you out with this process a bit. And Dan, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Yep. So really emphasizing the importance of sort of the monitoring and modeling in reference to sort of an adaptive management approach. We want to, you know, be able to have all this data so that it can inform decision makers on how best to manage the lake. And so Weston and Sampson developed a schedule of different measures that the water treatment plant should be taking, what their significance is, and how frequently they should be taking them, to sort of develop a program that is both informative for the water treatment plant's own use, but also for boards and staff that have some regulatory authority over the lake. And that is sort of how the adaptive management process works, is you know, having the data to tell you whether or not you need to adjust your regulations or your practices. And so a big part of the plan is setting basically recurring report coming from the water treatment plant to boards like the Conservation Commission, the Board of Health, and the Planning Board, who's the special permit granting authority for the watershed, so that they can understand, you know, what are the potential impacts of either interventions that have been taken to, you know, help protect the watershed, or other actions such as, you know, projects that have been permitted in the watershed, and sort of getting a sense of, you know, what direction we're heading in. And so having sort of these check-ins helps to move us forward and determine, you know, what is the right direction for the watershed. If you could turn to slide 21. So what Weston Sampson has done through this plan is look at barriers to watershed protection, as well as issues within the watershed. And from that, they developed this detailed program and policy recommendations that, you know, now those of us with the town get to run with. There is some minor work left to be done as they provide final lab results, and we work with them on recommendations. There's a final recommendation that was recently proposed to revisit lake access regulations, which sort of brings us to how these things get accomplished. So we have the plan, and some implementation coming out of this plan is clear cut, like educating the public and things like that. But others require, much more further input and support from leadership, because this is not just a plan for the watershed or a specific department. We all drink the water, and this plan is very interdepartmental, and it's going to be an interdepartmental cross-board effort to sort of make the recommendations in this plan happen. So while tonight we hope you vote to adopt this plan, we also hope for your support and guidance going forward to, so that we can all be on the same page in protecting North Andover's drinking water supply. And with that, happy to turn it over to questions or anything else.
Thank you, Jim, Dan, Jean, Andrew. I know you guys have worked really hard. It was a comprehensive report that you guys put together for us, so in a presentation, and I attended the public hearing, which was great too, to get the word out to our residents. So I will open it up to the board for questions.
I have a couple that I think are fairly quick, but, so is there a standard for how often we should do that sort of study? I mean, I'm sure it's more than frequently than 30 plus years. So, and I appreciate the work that, our water department does every year to stay on top of it, of course, but is there sort of a recommendation about how frequently we should bring in an outside source?
Yeah, and it's not a hard and fast recommendation, certainly, but in the plan, and generally speaking, we'd recommend about every 5 years is a good period of time to do like a full-blown study.
Okay, and one other question. When you were talking about the first recommendation, the expensive version, and indicating that you didn't think we'd see a huge improvement in parts per million by spending that much, what do you expect we will see from implementing the smaller improvements?
So from a modeling standpoint, it would probably be a pretty small number overall in the lake itself. So, but in the watershed, in that watershed, if you were looking at before and after, you could get a reduction as much as about 50% of the phosphorus.
Okay, that's awesome. Thank you.
Someplace between 30 and 50%.
Thank you.
So Jim, I was just wondering, did you include any of our zoning bylaws when you did this study? Like, for instance, we have I think it's 100-foot no build, 50-foot no disturb, something like that. Were any of those considered, and did you find that those zoning laws are consistent with what we were trying to achieve here?
Absolutely. So we did an audit of the town's development policy to take a look and see whether there were things that, you guys might like to tighten up a little bit, things you might like to change. Those bylaws were actually, in pretty good shape. The one thing that we came away from that audit with was that it would be nice to get a little more clarity around some of the standards. And as I mentioned earlier on, the town actually had started to undertake that as we were beginning the study, and so that's been completed. As far as, are those effective in terms of managing the lake, which I think maybe is part of what your question is getting at. I think that is part of the success story of the lake over the last 20 years. The improvement that you're seeing is at least in part because of the way you're managing land use. I think that the switch from septic systems to sewer system is obviously part of that too. There's something to be said the last couple of years for the weather that you've had. You had like kind of a really dry spell where the lake got kind of not in very good shape for a little while, and then you were having some algal blooms and stuff like that. But then we've had some very rainy years too, which kind of wash out some of the phosphorus. So we think that some of the some of the reduction in phosphorus that we saw this year might be because of, the heavy rain, helping to flush out the lake a little bit. But I think also because of those other things that we were just talking about, the improvement in wastewater management, and of course the strong development regulatory program that you folks have instituted in town. I think all those things together have played a role in helping to depress the phosphorus levels and getting the lake clarity improved, and really helping the ecology of your lake.
It's good to know that we've been doing the right thing all these years, so that's good.
Yeah, you guys are doing the right thing. You should keep doing that.
Speaking of phosphorus, is there other more environmentally friendly fertilizers or especially for the properties around the lake?
Yeah, there are approaches that you can use that actually eliminate phosphorus altogether. For managing landscapes. There are certainly parts of the country, watersheds, where there's sensitivity to phosphorus, and that phosphorus fertilizers have been eliminated altogether. So it is, the question as to whether there is fertilizer that eliminates phosphorus. Well, most fertilizer has at least some phosphorus in there, but there are techniques that you can use to reduce the phosphorus or eliminate that source of phosphorus altogether. Did that answer the question?
I think so. It's good to know that there are alternatives, short of just banning it altogether. But I think that if there is other products or other methods, we could probably move forward on encouraging people, especially with waterfront properties, to maybe take another look for the sake of the lake and the environment. Encourage them to do the right thing. So.
Definitely. Yeah, there's.
Where will we get that information?
If I may.
Yes, of course.
Our bylaw actually does limit the use of phosphorus and nitrogen in the fertilizers, so technically, people are not supposed to use it in the watershed. However, whenever they come before planning to permit land use, we actually require a deed restriction to put on property.
Could you say that, all of that in the microphone? Because that's kind of important information. Sorry about that.
So our zoning bylaw already conditions.
I thought it did, but
Yes.
when you said it in the report, it kind of confused me a little bit.
Yep,
Go
so-
ahead, Jean.
So we condition to limit phosphorus use and nitrogen use in the watershed. Enforcement's always a problem, but when somebody does come forward to the plan board and tries to permit land use activity, we actually request a deed restriction prior to the building permit being issued, where they actually have a deed restriction added to their property that calls for organic fertilizer and slow-release nitrogen products. And again, enforcement's the issue, and so Dan mentioned one of the recommendations is we better reach out to landscapers in the watershed. We all know who they are. I mean, we have a real strong landscape base here in town, and so to better educate them as well as the homeowner on the impacts of the fertilizers.
In the alternative really does work if you, well, we should really be encouraging that then.
Yep. So
For a
lot
whole
of-
bunch of reasons.
Yep,
but
a lot of it's education and, just better, I think, not only the homeowner, but the landscape population as well.
I think a lot of the issue is just what Gina's getting at, the people tend to overuse fertilizer because they want their grass to be green, and they
Yeah.
think that's the way to do it.
I mean, you see it, there's some of the nicest looking lawns as you drive around the lake, and so it's the approach, like how do we enforce the use and try to limit it?
I have to say, this year, everybody's grass was so green and for so long, and there's no way they were all using fertilizer. It was just probably because of all the rain, and
Yeah,
it's just amazing. It's like living in Ireland, It's everything's green. Okay, good to know. We probably, I think you're right, we should be reaching out to the landscapers, but we should probably be even reaching out to the homeowners through, some kind of a mailing or
Yeah. So
something. I think most people don't want to do the right thing, and if we could teach them that there is an alternative that would be more acceptable, I would think we would find most people would do that.
I
But
think it was approximately 3 years ago and 4 years ago, we sent a mailing through the planning department that described all of these uses, and what's surprising is so many people don't even know they live in the watershed, so we'd get calls from that mailing, and so I think it's something we have to do annually. It's
I think that's a great idea.
And I think we could include it in tax bills too, like the
Yeah.
spring
Right.
tax bill.
That's
As part
true.
of the flyer, to make people aware as we approach the summer that that's
Yeah,
coming.
and I think you're right, Vicki. I think that even just town-wide, if there's a better use, why aren't we doing it?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
I also like the Brooks School suggestion, because I think that's one of the questions that we get asked quite a bit, is why does Brooks School use gas-powered motors on the lake? And I think with today's technology, the electric-powered motors are just as fast. It was always a safety issue, right?
was safety
Right, so
for
that they
years.
could stay with their rowing teams. But now, the electric-powered motors have come such a long way that it's probably a good thing to relook at and say, do you still need the gas power? Can you get by with electric?
Well, with Tesla's results today in the stock market, making the trillion million dollar whatever, he's figured it out, so,
Peter, you probably can speak to it too, right, about the electric motors?
yeah.
They're
But it was
expensive,
safety,
but
in fairness, it really was safety. It was just that they were unreliable and couldn't keep up with it if someone fell out overboard or whatever. Of course, Madam Chair? Can-
Yeah, just Peter Boynton, Planning Board, and your volunteer harbor master.
We still owe you that cap, by the way.
That's true, Rosemary, yeah, but
We bribed him with a harbor master cap, and I look for them and I can't find them, so, a long time ago.
Mass Association of Harbor Masters, but I didn't say that.
Okay.
But to your point about the Brooks boats, the lake use regulations that the Select Board promulgated and then updated in 2016 was based on a working group that the Select Board had formed prior to them. And that working group recommended that, Brooks use the gas motors for safety purposes. But to your point, that same lake study working group, which Weston and Sampson referred in the watershed update, it's in there, recommended to revisit the use of gasoline engines by Brooks School in the future when electric motors were more available. So the Select Board has already noted that that should be done, and I agree with you that electric-powered boats are, at the point now where it really could be a consideration, and obviously not wanting to impact safety, but it's probably time to revisit that, and you've already enabled that in that work study.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The only question I have is that, you go back to 1987 and what we've learned since 1987 to today in terms of what's acceptable levels, what's what are the safety thresholds, right? Safe thresholds. So what is it in this plan that allows us to dynamically prepare and respond to that? Because as our research and plus what we put into the water and air shifts over time, as much as possible, we want to be proactive about that, not discover 40 years from now that X, if we kept an eye on X, we might have been able to, you understand where I'm coming from.
I
So-
think I do. So I guess let me start with the standards, I guess, of lake science. They really haven't changed that much over the last 50 years. They're pretty consistent. There's a guy named Carlson who developed what was referred to as a trophic standard that has to do with, basically the clarity of lakes and what their ecological status is. That information hasn't changed around that much. So the numbers that folks thought were appropriate back in 1987 are still appropriate today. I guess some of the bigger differences in between 1987 and now have more to do with some of the concerns that have arisen in the last few years, like cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. You know, that certainly existed before, but it's become much more prevalent concern now than it used to be. Frankly, you know, managing the phosphorus and managing, you know, the development on the outside of the watershed is probably you know, some of the best stuff that you can do to make sure that your water body stays clean. You have a nice clean lake. You know, it's in good quality. It was in less good quality in 1987, not terrible, but less good quality. It's better now. You know, I've been doing this kind of work for 28 years, and there aren't a lot of places that I go to where I have the opportunity to speak to a select board or a town council or a city council or anything like that, where I get to say, well, actually, your water body's improved in the last 20 years. So it's a huge success story. You know, I think it's a gem in your town, and I know you are. You should be very proud.
We are. Now the final test. Could you pronounce the name of our lake, please?
Lake Patriotic?
Pretty good. Not quite, but pretty good. Better than others. So.
I just had a quick question for you. So the phosphorus levels we talk come from fertilizer. Does it come from, just so people know, does it come from other sources too? And what would those be?
Yeah, so phosphorus can certainly come from a lot of different sources. Fertilizer is one. Wastewater is another. Other you know, deposition of feces is another one too. So, you know, you think about wastewater, and that's probably a very significant one for a lot of lakes. But then so is wildlife management. So managing the waterfowl on the lakes and, you know, on your lake. And that seems to be in pretty decent shape at the moment. Atmospheric deposition is another source. So phosphorus attaches itself to particulates. And frankly, the industrial burning of fossil fuels and things like that out in Ohio or, you know, wherever it is within the airshed that it actually ends up over here, they send it up into the sky very high. It comes back down again, comes back down in New England. You know, that's gotten better over the years, but it, you know, remains an issue. You know, other issues of concern, and some of them, you know, we don't really have a whole heck of a lot of control over climate change. As the climate warms up, the likely, you know, it increases the energy that's available in the ecology, and you get more stuff like cyanobacteria blooms and weird invasive species showing up and things like that. That goes a little beyond the phosphorus question, but.
No, that's great, thank you. And then as the phosphorus increases, does that also increase the plant life and the algae that's in, so those are
Yeah, so there's a
connected?
linkage between the phosphorus, the what's referred to as chlorophyll A, that's the thing that folks monitor for. That's a chemical that's really, or a compound that's really important in photosynthesis.
Yep.
So that's really, it's in algae quite a bit.
Okay.
So, so it increases the plant life, and that decreases the clarity. So those three things together are very tightly linked. And as mentioned, the gentleman Carlson, who came up with an index for this back, I think in the 1950s or something like that. Anyways, what he basically said is that there's a strong correlation between these things. These things are linked, and so if you can measure one, you can tell something about the other two, which is why the Secchi disk data was very important to us.
Great, thank you. And just to build off of Janice's question about how often we should do the reports, if we were to do them more frequently, does your workload sort of decrease? You know what I mean? Like, you're able to kind of keep up on that data a little bit easier too, or?
I guess what it really does is it gives you more certainty that things are not going awry.
Okay.
Yeah. It allows you to, if things do start to go in a direction that's not good, it allows you to respond more quickly.
Yeah.
If you're doing those sorts of studies more frequently than, say, like every to do like a really good lake study, it takes about 24 months of
Right.
data. You have to collect data on a monthly basis, and you got to do it at least for a year, or you don't really get a good sense of seasonality. And frankly, if you're not doing it for a couple of years, you're still kind of guessing, because you can have 1 year that's a little bit out of whack, right? You know, sort of an outlier, and that might give you the wrong idea about your water body.
Yeah.
You know, you want to try and collect 2 years of sampling data, ideally, and then it doesn't make sense to go back and do it much more regularly than about every 5 years, because not that much has changed. So if you do it every 5 years, you have a really good sense of what's going on in the watershed, and what's improving and what's not improving. Now, of course, your water department collects a lot of this data regularly, so if they're collecting the data anyway, somebody can just come in and analyze it. They probably want to do a little of their own data collection too. You know, that, as I mentioned before, that data is like a treasure trove. It's a lot of data.
Madam Chair, while we're talking about the water department, who are actually literally behind our clean water, can I just recognize them because they're here and they never come out from the water plant. So we have Superintendent Glenn Alt and our lab director Tiffany Blake, and of course DPW Director Jim Stanford. But you know, they're the ones keeping all of our water clean and safe every day. So
And
thanks, guys.
we always seem to have award-winning water.
We do.
I can't remember if we got it again this year, but every year we seem to do really well. So thank you for the good work. So.
Thank you, and thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? No? Thank you so much. This was so informative and helpful.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to work with you folks.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Madam Chair, do we want to vote to adopt the watershed plan before they leave?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I would move approval on the adoption of the Lake of Chickaway watershed plan. It's not, it's.
I'm still practicing it. Don't worry.
I will second. I have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, excellent. Passes 5-0. We have a new watershed plan after 30 years.
Good work, guys.
Thank you. So we will go back to item A, which would be our Route 125 corridor study, which I believe Jean Enright and Dan Beckley will be presenting on. Dan, you can't leave us yet.
Clear the room.
Oh, and Andrew.
Oh, look at that.
You all are getting your money's worth in terms of plans tonight. While this gentleman sets up the presentation, I'll just do a quick introduction of this project and give you a little context for why we're here with this. So toward the end of last, and by the way, for the record, Andrew Shapiro, Director of Community and Economic Development. Good to see everyone again. Toward the end of last year, we were fortunate to receive a grant from Mass Development through its Real Estate Technical Assistance Program. That program is designed to help communities throughout Massachusetts basically conduct studies or do some in-depth analyses of complex real estate projects or projects to see if they could, for redevelopment and economic development purposes. In this case, we chose to fund an area plan, a corridor study of Route 125 from Sutton Street to the Haverhill Line. Reason being, as you all know, there's a lot of activity going on there. We just heard about Lake of Chickwick, so clearly that corridor also plays into the health and the sustainability of the lake. But also we have the Minco development on the corner of Sutton Street, 136 units going in, the senior center, we have the airport. Further up the street, we just had the completion of the Princeton Properties project, and in front of it, commercial redevelopment. Of course, Barker Farm is a major, large, parcel and a historic property and an open space that has a lot of value to people in town. And then toward the Haverhill line, of course, we have Osgood Landing, where we have the new Amazon facility going in. And I should also mention the sewer line extension. So with all of these intersecting things happening, we just thought it was a really good idea to bring in some expertise to look at this, all the issues along the corridor, everything from streetscape, pedestrian, bicycle, and motor vehicle safety, and of course, land use issues and economic development opportunities. So when we got that grant from Mass Development, we matched it with some of our own money. We got $50,000 from Mass Development, matched it with $25,000 from our municipal discretionary funding from Columbia Gas. Mass Development hooked us up with Niche Engineering. So to my left is Brian Creamer from Niche Engineering, as well as Innes Associates. Emily Innes is with us this evening, and she did the land use analysis and the zoning study. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian. I want to thank his team. I want to get my thank yous in before I leave. So his team, obviously Emily Innes with Innes Associates, Dan Beckley and Gene Enright, my colleagues in the planning department, and really just a lot of different people who really kind of played a good role in terms of stakeholder engagement, public outreach. We got a lot of great feedback, which you'll hear about in a moment. And so I think we came away with some really good actionable strategies here. So with that, I'll pass it over to Brian and his colleagues.
Thank you, Andrew. Very much. I think everyone's going to join me, but nice to see you all. This on a personal note, this one's very close to my heart. My father worked at Lucent for 13 years, and it's kind of great as an opportunity as a professional to get to work on a place that's close to home. So, and it's a road I think we all know very, very well. So I think, Emily, you're going to take us off tonight, and I'll chime in as we go here.
Great, thank you. Pleasure to be here tonight. My name is Emily Ennis. I'm a land use planner and urban designer from Innes Associates.
And good evening. My name is John Mikulak. I'm the Deputy Director of Transportation Engineering at Niche Engineering. And I want to thank you for inviting us here on behalf of Niche Engineering and Innes Design to present to you the 125 acre study that we just recently completed.
So I'll take us through the beginning, folks, here, and we'll basically start by giving you a quick introduction about what the plan was about, what we were specifically looking at. We'll look at the corridor zoning and land use and some parking requirements and regulations, some opportunity for the corridor, the roadway itself, and some constraints around that. And then we'll sum it up with some next steps and where we hope you'll head with the end of the plan. We learned a lot over the last 6 months. We heard a lot from the public. But the limits of the plan, I guess, is an important distinction, right? It's a long and important road that cuts through town. We were looking specifically from the Haverhill line, the Haverhill North Andover town line, past Osgood Landing, south past Barker's Farm, past the airport, and the study area ended at Sutton Street, next to China Blossom. And portion of the study area did overlap with the Lake Cochickawit. Did I get it? It's worth a shot, you know? Yeah. And it's built off a lot of the really important and ongoing work that the town is doing and has done over the last several years, certainly from the 2018 master plan update, the current watershed plan that just wrapped up this evening, the really important MassWorks grant, the sewer expansion project, and then certainly the Amazon Osgood Landing redevelopment. We looked specifically at a few key intersections, so certainly the intersection at Sutton Street, Great Pond Road, 133, the intersection with Barker Street and Osgood, and then up at Holt Road, the major three-way intersection there. What we didn't take a really detailed look at, because that's currently under, I'll say, design and really going to be implemented very soon, is the two intersections at the Amazon site facility. And then we looked at the multitude of zoning districts along the corridor itself and the overlays associated with them. We did receive a lot of feedback, and we tried our best to kind of reach out to the community. So, John, you want to take us through that?
Sure. We had an involved community engagement process. We used several different methods to try to reach out to as many different groups as possible, solicit as much input and comments as we could. We started off with a corridor site visit on a Saturday morning on May 1st. It didn't seem safe to walk along the corridor, so what we did is we set 3 separate areas along the corridor, and we invited people to meet with us. One in Mad Maggie's parking lot, one at Princeton Properties, and then again later on in the day at Osgood Landing. So we were able to generate some good feedback. We got people out there on a Saturday morning, and they told us their ideas of what improvements could be made along the corridor. We also had individual stakeholder interviews. We reached out to people virtually, and we're able to do this with almost a dozen different agencies, property owners, landholders, and also the MVRTA and the Planning Commission. So we were able to reach out to these different groups and get comments on a one-on-one, and usually these interviews lasted either a half hour or 45 minutes, and we got a lot of great information. We also set up a website, and we set up an online survey on that, and we actually got some pretty good feedback in using that method too from other people that didn't attend the site walk, and we got 116 people responded to that online survey. And the results of the survey, we asked a few questions to try to get ideas as to what people thought was great about the corridor, or what they thought could be improved. And some of the strengths and the positive feedback we heard is there's a good mix of businesses and uses along the corridor. The proximity to 495, Ward Hill, and the nearby business parks was a bonus. There's a number of items that people didn't feel as strongly either way about. There's a mix of building types, the vehicular access to neighborhoods and businesses, the proximity to the airport, and also open spaces. But where people thought that there could be improvement, or what they identified as the weaknesses along the corridor, and one of the common themes was the pedestrian connectivity, accessibility, and the lack of bicycle accommodations. They also mentioned that there seemed to be a lack of mixed use. They wanted to see more mixed use, more residents, and maybe more commercial space along the corridor to build it out and fill it out.
Funny, that was listed as a strength, and then it was listed as a weakness.
It was very interesting that people saw it as a positive, but they want more.
Yeah, that's probably a good way of saying it.
We also followed up with a community meeting that was held virtually on June 22nd. And we had a few people attend virtually, and we were able to get additional comments. And we presented a draft of our findings as we were developing the report. And then we also conducted a road safety audit with Massdot. We prepared all the documentation, submitted it to Massdot. We held a site walk with Massdot and many of the town representatives. We had about a dozen people show up on the site walk, and we walked the corridor from Sutton Street up to Commerce Way. Those were areas that were identified as high crash locations along that section of the corridor. So with Massdot's involvement, and then ultimately they approved the road safety audit, which gets posted on Massdot's website, that also can lead to if any project or improvements are done, making the project eligible for highway safety improvement program funding. So that was a good task, and it also gave us a lot of good safety recommendations in the report.
So one of the interesting things about a corridor tends to be the feeling that people have that there's not really a place there. It's a stretch of road that people travel along, going one place to the other, but they don't often stop there. This is an interesting corridor because it does have a mix of uses, which we've mentioned before. It's also got an airport on one side of the corridor and a lot of residential on the other. So there's a lot of different ways of thinking about what the identity of this corridor could be. Now, you saw on the zoning map in one of the earlier slides that there are a lot of different zoning districts as well. And so in starting off with the land use analysis, it was interesting how many land uses had different descriptions in each of the zones. One of the things that we talked about was the idea of restaurants. Well, in one zone, it's restaurants are allowed. In another, it's restaurants and cafes. In another, it's eating and drinking establishments. None of these are actually defined as terms in the zoning. So it became a challenge in understanding actually what could happen along the corridor. And in some cases, adjacent parcels might be developed very, very differently. So what we wanted to do was think about land use and also think about how the current different zoning districts govern what could happen on each of the parcels. And then if we were to change the zoning to accommodate new ways of building mixed use, new ways of building industrial, these types of buildings are changing in terms of their dimensions. how would we do that? And then finally, trying to add in the bikeability, the walkability of the area, knowing that we've got a twisty road that has some interesting sight lines. If you're coming down the hill or coming up the hill, how would you do that? So what we tried to do were these test studies. And we chose 4 sites, and I want to stress right now that these are not projects. I think sometimes when people look at a presentation afterwards, they think, oh my goodness, something's being built here. We use test fits to say, if we have different conditions of parcel sizes, parcel shapes, maybe we're assembling parcels, and we apply the current zoning and change the rules a little bit, what would that look like? And so we had 4 test sites along here. And thank you to some of the property owners that we talked to about letting us use their sites for test fits. Others we just chose because of their characteristics. And for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to look at test fit site 3 to show you what we did with that. So Beechwood Drive, you can see the parcel called out here. I think there's actually a little piece where the line goes over into another property in terms of what's in GIS and what's actually happening right now. But you can see it called out there. And if you go to the next slide, thank you. We tested 3 different scenarios. One was a light industrial scenario, looking at the top end of the parcel closest to Haverhill. What would happen if light industrial moved down the corridor? We looked at mixed use, in this case office and restaurant, and retail. The restaurant's going to be important for our discussion. And then we also looked at the idea of what happens if it's residential only. And in doing this, it was what are the current dimensions for these types of buildings in terms of height, in terms of depth, in terms of length? What are the current parking requirements? We looked at having them set back a little bit further of the street. One reason for that is because many of the buildings that are on there now do that. Another reason is because that would allow for an easement that could have a pedestrian, bike, mixed use, or multi-use path along there. What we found is that there's some minor things that need tweaking, such as your height, but one of the interesting things is your parking requirements are very different from some of the other communities around you, and in particular, your parking requirements for a restaurant, which are 15 spaces per 1,000 square feet, gross square feet of the restaurant. That's extremely high. And if you go to the next slide. So on this side, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see there's a very large gray rectangle there. And that is for all of the test sites we did. We used a 5,000 square foot restaurant. We measured a couple of the standalone restaurants in the area and took that. That would require 75 parking spaces. And you can see how much land is needed to accommodate those parking spaces and your office. On the right-hand side, we dropped it down to 4 parking spaces per 1,000, which is much closer to your surrounding areas. I looked at a couple of different towns that also had long corridors, and I also looked at the adjacent towns. Now, most of them are actually doing parking requirements based on the number of seats rather than the number of gross square footage. So I extrapolated and said, okay, 4 looks like a good compromise based on what I'm seeing. You can see there's a significant reduction of parking in this area. Now, this isn't assuming anything about parking management strategies or anything like that, but just in terms of available land for development, that's one element that was really holding this corridor back. There are others that we found through this, the land uses being one, the height is another, but the parking restriction or the parking requirement was definitely with a key problem in terms of what could happen with this. So we're going to turn it over to Brian, but I'll just say that one of the things that came out of this was thinking about how we now address this in light of the other changes that we're looking at. So Brian?
Sure. So we also took a keen look certainly at the private development parcels, right, the parcels that abutting the corridor itself. We also took a look at the roadway, right, the infrastructure that exists between Sutton Street and the town line. Certainly the intersections kind of pose the most challenges, but the most opportunities. And we also took a keen look at just what the typical roadway section might look like and what it feels like. Because as you all know today, right, it's a 4-lane road. relatively wide lane widths, and not super friendly to anything that isn't a car. So we looked at 3 options. We looked at kind of 2 options, option 1 and 2, which keep that 4-lane system, add a little bit of buffer at the edges, right? So add kind of a buffer right at the roadside edge, and then in the option 1 scenario, added kind of a vegetated buffer. This one we chose the west side, and really wanted to make the most of that road edge condition to increase pedestrian safety, increase bicycle mobility, and really just increase access to these properties. We understand it's a corridor that relatively high speeds at times. The speed came up several times in the survey responses. One of the methods to mitigate that is a road diet, right? Or at least kind of narrowing the field of vision of the driver. And one method to do that is add vegetation and add some sidewalks, really, is at its core what we're looking at here. Option 2, we certainly looked at the scenario where you have a bike lane on the roadway itself. This presents some, I'll say, safety challenges for the cyclists themselves. These could be a protected bike lane. We just want to see if it could fit physically. And then we want to make the most of the entire road cross-section. And then option 3, which we after running some additional models, had some challenges. We looked at a true road diet where we went from the 4-lane to a 2-lane in either direction and a center left turn lane. This one, the traffic pre-COVID really does not support using that going forward. We understand the traffic levels are basically at pre-pandemic levels at this point in time, and we really wouldn't recommend that option going forward, just from a level of service at the intersections stability. So what I want to run through today is kind of what these options might look like, specifically at Butcher Boy Plaza, the intersection of Commerce Way, Great Pond Road, and that section of road there. And what you're seeing here, option 1, this is we term this the shared use option, shared use path option, where we have a much wider sidewalk on the west side of the road. We teed up the intersection at Great Pond Road 133 and got rid of the slip lane. So I guess if you're coming northbound, I think you might all be familiar where you just continue and veer off to the right going towards Brooks. That intersection presents certainly some challenges from a pedestrian safety perspective. As a teed up and adding crosswalks, it provides a lot of benefit to pedestrian and cyclists. And it provides a really great opportunity to add some vegetation along the side of the road. This accompanies that, lower speeds and really a calmer road where you're not actually reducing any lane number of lanes. You're just reducing the overall visual width of the road. The 2A is the bike on the road scenario. We again looked at teeing up the intersection and looked at how the left turn movement getting into Butcher Boy might be altered. And there's some challenges there. It is also not a recommended option. We took this opportunity to also look at a scenario where the connection to Butcher Boy Plaza used Route 133. This is an altered driveway scenario. This is really outside of the town's purview, right? You can't really make them do this. But it does present some pedestrian and vehicular kind of safety improvements at the intersection itself. It certainly slows cars, but queuing, particularly at the Mad Maggie's exit, could be an issue, and it's something we definitely, if this ever were to happen, is something we definitely need to look very carefully at. And then the third option here, the true road diet, again, doesn't work from a traffic volume perspective. And while it looks great on paper, it's a great dream, but it's not a viable option really. So those are some pros and cons. I think I've just kind of hit them all, but most of them have private property impacts in some form or another. Option 1 has kind of the fewest. You have a relatively wide right-of-way and probably enough space in most of the corridor to provide that shared use path along the large majority of it. So with that, I'll bring it into our recommendations and next steps. Go first.
Great, thank you. So in terms of zoning and land use, the recommendations we have are really to consolidate the districts that are there. We looked at creating a corridor district, which could be an overlay district or could be a new district, one parcel deep on both sides of the corridor. That allows the neighborhoods to stay as they are. It doesn't touch the airport, but it does allow the possibility of having a single identity or an identity that shifts as you move along the corridor appropriately for the uses there. And as part of that, looking at the land uses, updating some of them, consolidating some of them. So rather than, because a lot of the districts that are along the corridor are also in other parts of town, there are uses in those districts, in the districts that aren't really appropriate for the corridor, but they're allowable. So changing that to just, make sure that there's a consistent identity of land uses along the corridor. The other piece is rethinking the dimensional standards, as I mentioned. I mean, certainly you've got Amazon going in now, but the requirements for distribution warehouses, a little bit taller than they used to be. The requirements for lab or for light industrial, very different. Ground floor retail and restaurant, those ceiling heights are getting higher now than they used to be. There's preferences for the higher ceiling, especially for restaurants, which throws the total height limitation off. So looking at what's important there, encouraging development standards and design guidelines to make sure that there's a consistent feel throughout the corridor, and also that there's not an undue impact on any residential that's behind it. And then reviewing the parking requirements. Now, I did take, as I mentioned, that broad look at what parking is for restaurants for communities that had corridors as well as downtowns, because it's important to remember this is not currently a walkable area. You're going to need a little bit more parking. So doing a more exhaustive study and checking the other uses as well. Again, as industrial uses change, the type of parking that's needed for those uses is also changing. And so really coming up with a strategy for the land use and for the zoning that is appropriate for the entire corridor.
So in addition to looking at the zoning and land use modifications that could be made along the corridor, you can also take the opportunity to look at any infrastructure improvements based on the study. We recommend that you continue to look into these funding opportunities. We identified several of them in the report. One of them being a Massdot tip project. If there was a desire to reconstruct the entire corridor, that would likely have to go through Massdot, and you'd want to get that project on the tip. That would probably be the most costly. But there are other funding opportunities such as complete streets, mass development, and things that can be done for specific projects. You can identify projects that address some of the safety issues that were brought up through the public process and the road safety audit. You could start by just doing a more detailed schematic design of the corridor to evaluate whether you wanted to go with the shared use path and what would those impacts be along the corridor. There's also opportunities to connect the sidewalk, implement some traffic calming elements to try to slow down traffic speeds. Another item that was identified was there's no connection between the signals. You could interconnect the signals and help with some of the congestion issues during peak hour. You could also look at accommodating bikes somehow. Another comment was made that there are faded pavement markings. Sometimes you can repaint the markings, and that will help improve traffic, clear some of the vegetation around the sign. So the road safety audit is a good report that identifies the minimal cost, low cost, low hanging fruit improvements that can be made, all the way to larger improvements. Removing the slip lane at Osgood Street was identified as one of the hazardous vehicular areas, or a traffic study to see if a signal is warranted across from Commerce Way at Butcher Boy's driveway. So there's a bunch of other smaller projects that could be broken out, and a number of funding opportunities that the town could look at. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Open to questions.
Yeah, getting back to the parking for the restaurants in particular, it's quite a big difference. But I will say that from a marketing standpoint of restaurants, you don't want what looks like a few cars in this big parking lot. You want the parking lot to look full. But you spoke to one of the first things that I thought of, but if you were comparing us to, small downtown restaurants, of course, the parking can spill over into the streets and not just, but you mentioned that you are sort of pretty much took that into consideration. But I do agree with you. For people to want to enter a restaurant, they want to come into a place where the parking lot looks full. And if you have an abundance of parking, or overabundance is probably a better phrase, it might not look like such a great restaurant. And that's certainly not what we want. I mean, and nor does the restaurant. They want better marketing, so, from just visual marketing.
It's absolutely a balance, isn't it, right? You want the restaurant to look popular enough that you want to go there, right? This is a happening place, but you don't want it to be so jammed and so parked up that you actually can't
You can't
get
find a
in.
place to
Yeah,
park.
exactly. And it's one of the reasons I didn't want to come out and say, look, this is exactly the ratio that you need. Some of it's going to be market-driven. Somebody would come in and say, I'm going to do a restaurant, it's going to be so many seats, I want this much parking. But what you don't want to be requirements to be too far above what the market actually needs. And it's finding that balance. And again, I think it needs a little bit more work in terms of a full recommendation, because there is that sort of local balance, and there's also what are the other communities doing, and do they have the same conditions? And that's where having a one-size-fits-all parking ratio doesn't necessarily work. So there is going to be one for the downtown, there's going to be one for the corridor, and it's finding what that right step is.
I would also think that it might even depend on the type of establishment. And I really don't know how to wrap my mind around that. I'm sure you do, as to, a fast food
Yes.
versus a sit-down restaurant. I just don't, I have to think about that. Do you need more, get them in, get them out, and maybe not as many for, sort of a very nice sit-down restaurant? I don't know. That's your job.
But you're absolutely right. That is a dividing line, and many communities do that, as they have one standard for fast food and one standard for sit-down as well.
I absolutely agree with you. It should be based upon the number of seats in the restaurant more than square footage, unless it's a type of restaurant that, that does a lot of demonstration type cooking and they need more space or something like that. That you often find in Asian restaurants, that they bring out the flames,
Andrew, can you speak to it a little bit?
I just want to make one additional comment. I think the conversation here has been great. I appreciate the analysis, and I appreciate the comments from Selectwoman Smedili. But, just looking at this when I came in a couple of years ago and looking at it from an economic development standpoint, I have to say, because you all obviously see this with respect to, restaurants that are seeking relief from their parking standards. I know we saw, for instance, a boba tea establishment going into the plaza where Captain Pizza is, and they came before you to seek relief for their parking standard. And oftentimes, restaurants will go before the planning board, and it's usually within the context of a multi-tenant strip mall, because a lot of the parking requirement is sucked up by the other establishments. But it just speaks to, if we can maybe lower the parking requirement to something that resembles some of what the other communities in the area are doing, that'll happen less often, and it'll be one less regulatory or red tape type hurdle that some of these establishments will have to go through. And to your point, Selectwoman, it's some of it's market driven, right? So if they don't feel like the amount of parking, the lower end of the parking amount is appropriate, they can certainly seek more, or find ways to accommodate. But we can push the threshold lower so that if they don't think it's necessary, it makes it a little easier for them on the front end to get in and get started as a business. I just wanted to make that comment with respect to parking. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Great job, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Madam Town Manager, we'll move it over to you for an update. on the American Rescue Plan?
Goodness gracious.
Thank you.
The machinery's getting to work out tonight.
You know how fast I talk though, so
She is a fast
we're gonna talk a little bit about, hopefully,
Makes sense.
you see it down there?
Nope, yes.
No.
How we
Yes.
do.
There we go. Okay, we're gonna talk a little bit about our opera funding. Okay, so basically, what is opera funding? And, you know, a lot of the time we used, in the municipalities, all kinds of hybrids and definitions that are not very friendly at home, but it's part of the American Rescue Plan, which was signed by the president on March 11th. There's $350 billion for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments to respond to the COVID-19 emergency and bring back jobs. And what's interesting, the timing of this is interesting because today the House sent out their version of the state bill, which we're reviewing right now. So it kind of all is coming together. But in North Andover, we know that we're getting $9.1 million directly. About $3 million of that was direct municipal aid, and the other $6 million is because we don't have a county government. So if we did have a county government, like there are some, still exist in Massachusetts, they receive just the direct municipal aid and are basically applying to their counties. We don't have to do that. We just got a disbursement. We'll be getting a disbursement based on population. So earlier in the year, the U.S. Treasury released what they called the interim final rule, which set forth the eligible uses for the funding. And there was 4 funding objectives and 6 eligible categories. The funding has to be obligated by 12/31/24, meaning we have to have a contract signed by that date and spent by 12/31/26. So there was 4 funding objectives. One was to support COVID-19 response efforts, just to decrease the spread of the virus. Another was to replace lost public sector revenue. The third was to support immediate economic stabilization for households and businesses. And the final one was to address systemic public health and economic challenges that happened due to the pandemic. And then there's 6 categories that you can spend in. And this is the first eligible category, which is to support public health response. So you can fund COVID-19 mitigation efforts, medical expenses, behavioral health care, and certain public health and safety staff. So some examples of this are vaccine clinics, contact tracing costs, behavioral services like mental health and crisis intervention, and payroll and benefits for public health, health care, human services, and public safety staff to the extent they work on COVID-19 response. So you can't just bring somebody on and say it's COVID-19. It has to be directly related to COVID-19. The second category was to replace public sector revenue loss. So this was to use funds to provide government services to the extent that we lost funding due to the pandemic. So we're permitted to calculate 4 different periods of time going through December 31st, 2023 to determine whether or not we've experienced any loss in revenue. And they just came out with this super confusing calculation that made everybody's kind of eyes glass over, but that we will be using to see if we have revenue loss. It's calculated relative to the expected trend. So it begins with the last full fiscal year pre-pandemic and then adjusts annually for growth. And basically, if we do determine that we had a public sector revenue loss due to the pandemic, that money can be spent on anything without appropriation. The third criteria is water and sewer infrastructure. So we can make necessary investments to improve access to clean drinking water, which we just learned all about, and invest in wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. I anticipate that a lot of the state bill will probably focus on this part as well. It can be buildings or facilities upgrades, and the eligible uses have to be aligned with EPA project categories. So if you could apply for an SRF loan or you apply for a fund revolving loan, which we often use to do our water repairs, you could use this money for those. The fourth one is to address negative economic impacts. And that's supposed to respond to economic harms, not just to the public sector, but to the community at large. So some of the examples that they talked about was assistance to workers and families, aids to households, survivor benefits, small business loans and grants, speeding the recovery of impact industries, so like tourism, and then rebuilding your public sector capacity by rehiring staff and implementing economic relief programs. The fifth is premium pay for essential workers. This was offering additional support to those who have and will bear the greatest health risks because of their service in critical infrastructure sectors. So this was premium pay. It's supposed to prioritize low and moderate income workers, and those sectors were healthcare, grocery and food service, education, childcare, sanitation, and transit. The sixth criteria was broadband improvements and infrastructure, so to make necessary investments to provide underserved or unserved locations with new or expanded broadband access. It's supposed to be focusing on homes and businesses without access and reliability projects. Interestingly, we did at one point do a survey in the schools about people who were underserved or had underserved locations, and it actually was not near what we had originally thought it would be. So this may not be as high a priority for us, but we do have our IT director at a cybersecurity seminar today, so I'm sure he'll come back with ideas on ways to spend this money. So ineligible uses were just as long as the eligible uses. You cannot put money towards a pension fund. You cannot make payments to your stabilization account. So you can't say, I don't know what I want to do with this right now. I'm going to save it. They're not going to allow that. And you can't just use it on regular capital projects unless you have that revenue loss calculation. So if we calculated the revenue loss, determined it was exactly what we needed for the inflation for the senior center, we could use it for that. But we have to be very strategic about how we do that. A capital project can be linked to one of the eligible categories. So for instance, if you had wanted to work on an outdoor space, say for instance, the senior center wanted to put a patio in so they could do outdoor programming, we could link it like that. So how are we going to manage the funds? And we learned through the CARES Act funding, which was literally 1/3 of this, that it was a really difficult process. So we've decided to take a regional approach. MAPC has invited us to work through an RFP process. MAPC is kind of the planning group that's out of Boston, that's seeking proposals to help a group of towns with fund management reporting. So we're partnering with Hamilton, Topsfield, Manchester, Rockport, Marblehead, Essex, Wenham, Boxford, and us. I think we're actually the biggest. I think Middleton has now hopped in as well. The RFP is actually out right now. But what we anticipate doing is having someone come on, not only to help us manage the funds, manage the reporting, but also, is this eligible, is this not eligible? So that we'll have an expert that will be able to go to us. Because the last thing you want to do is spend the money and then find out it was not eligible. The next thing we're going to be undergoing, and this has really been Laurie's baby, is the public process. And so if you read the interim final rule, which I keep joking about how something can be both interim and final at the same time, but it is, it's really urging us to engage with our constituents to develop plans to use the money and to really understand what the impact has been from COVID. And so we've seen what we know for impacts, but we don't know what people are seeing back. So we've partnered with Polco, and they're going to be doing a series of surveys regarding the funding and how to prioritize the spending. The survey is really designed around the Treasury guidelines. It's going to help us assess needs, align the funds with our priorities, address equity and inclusion, and document the progress. We're surveying both residents and businesses. They're doing this across the nation with Polco. So many communities are using them, and we'll benchmark how we're doing, who's been the most impacted, how to move forward, and they'll be able to benchmark other communities as well. And they're going to do 2 surveys a year for 3 years, I believe. So we'll be releasing that survey pretty soon.
Excuse me, Madam Town Manager.
Yeah. Okay. Polco is the name of the company that's going to be doing the surveys.
Okay, it's not like a government entity or anything
No,
like that? Okay.
no. But they partnered with ICMA, which is mine and Dee's organization, and a lot of groups are going with them because we're all using the same questions. So far we have done a little bit of spending. It's been very limited. We added an additional community support coordinator who's assisting with COVID-related mental health issues that we're experiencing. One of the things that has come out of COVID is that we are seeing more mental health issues than ever before. Regular mental health issues related to anxiety, but also a lot of substance abuse and domestic violence type situations. And so I don't know if you remember Crystal McClooney, who used to work down in the Veterans Office. She's back with the town working as our second community support coordinator. We've increased the hours for our amazing social media analyst, who she's been so key in our COVID-19 education. So she's been come on and doing a lot of the outreach that we're doing. We've increased education and training for our public health team, just because there's so much still to learn about the pandemic, about our response, how to respond if this ever happens again. We've increased hours for the public health nurse. Amazingly, we did not have a full-time public health nurse. It may have felt that way, but we did not. So we have made that position 40 hours. We've done some IT needs for security, and we have the survey company that we're working with. But so far, we really have not made much of a dent, obviously, into the $9 million, and we won't start really formulating the full plan until we do the survey so that we can see what the needs are like. So just wanted to update you. We'll get this on the website. We'll get a website going for APA, so people will kind of see the survey results, better understand how the money can be spent, better understand what we're getting. We are going to be making some requests. You probably saw me, Andrew, and Jean all make eye contact when they were talking in the water about that should be one of them. We only have about 24 hours to make the requests to the State House, so we're going to be making about 8 requests tomorrow for the state bill as well. But that would be in addition to the $9 million. So.
What's the timeline for the survey, and then what would you expect for a timeline where we can actually start spending some of this money to provide relief for people?
We've started having meetings already, internal meetings about, brainstorming ideas for projects. The survey, did they tell us, Laurie, we met with them last? I think they said they're ready to go, right? Yeah. So we should be seeing the survey within the next week or two, the first initial survey. And then we'll release all of the results. And then our group will come back together and come forward with a plan to bring towards you, and I anticipate we'll have a public hearing on it so that we can get public input that way as well. So short-term plan.
So if I pull it all together, this is something that could be happening in this fiscal year.
Yes.
Before we get to the end of the fiscal year. So
Absolutely.
this is impacting us now. That's okay. That's great.
Yeah.
That's good.
It's exciting. It's also kind of fun that it has so much public input required because we're able to really get an understanding of how people were impacted, more than just the phone calls we've taken in and what we've seen on the food line. And we'll be able to involve the businesses as well, which is great.
I also think working with other communities, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah.
I think we've got in a lot of ways, we've got a great handle on, but we also don't know what we don't know, and more creative minds in figuring out, or maybe working together to strengthen services like we do for some other things. I think this is perfect.
Plus, our amazing finance director is one person. Not all communities have one person who's the town accountant and the finance director. Between FEMA, CARES Act, and now the opera funding, I mean, that's a full-time job on its own. A lot of communities have hired someone to do it, which is why it's great that we could do it regionally.
Good.
I just have a technical question. When you said loss of revenue, right? Are we talking about the passport money that we didn't get and the meals tax money that we didn't get because the restaurant shut down, that sort of stuff?
Yes. So
Okay.
it's very formulaic. Because it would have been easier if we could just say this is factual. We know these were our forecasts and this is what we think we lost, but then won't let us do it that way. So it's very formulaic. So we'll be anticipating what that's going to look like. It may be that we don't think we need to do the revenue reimbursement and that we want to just focus on the other 5 criteria. And honestly, that would be fine because at least then we know we'd be putting the money back into the community. So.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
A lot of stuff tonight.
I know, all good stuff. All right, so we took care of, that's all our governmental reports for this evening. We took care of A and B on the new business, so we're on to C, which is our budget policy statement.
Great. So we've made some small updates to the budget policy statement. If you remember correctly, we talked about how during our goal setting particularly, that we wanted to make sure that what we were putting in the budget policy wasn't all of our goals anymore, but was really our finance-oriented goals. And so we focused on that this year. We also made some changes just to the way it was drafted to update. Last time this was updated was quite a few years ago, and we have had some changes to how we develop the budget and how we're doing forecasting, et cetera. So we made sure that everything was updated.
I thought it was laid out really well, and I thought you tied in our budget, our goals very well.
Well, kudos to Laurie and Lynn, because they work on this with me as well, and it's a great group effort.
Plus,
Thank
I think
you.
reiterating the reserve policies, I think is really crucial. So people as those reserves are large and used and so forth, why they are what they are and why we maintain them. I think this is just really valuable information for our town, for the warrant, that we want to continue to reinforce with folks. Just not the money we're spending or the money that the revenue that's coming in, it's.
Like what the goal is for savings.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Where are we going with all this?
No, you're absolutely right, and that's what makes us have such AAA bond rated. That's what gives us, stability. So I agree with you on that.
And the definitions of school department, or, you know, what their special ed fund is and why we have it, and the enterprise fund, and all that. So I think it's good information for everybody. All right, well, if there are no more questions for our town manager on that, I'll entertain a motion to adopt our fiscal year 23 budget policy statement as
Madam Chair, I'll
presented.
move the select board adopt the FY23 budget policy statement as presented.
Second that.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Excellent. Passes 5-0.
We're on the
Is
hook
that-
for it
yep.
now.
Are we on, is that step 2 of the budget plan, the budget schedule? Check the box. Okay, so we will move on to a request from our Patriotic Observance Committee to close the end of First Main at Main Street and conduct a Veterans Day Parade down Main Street to Patriots Memorial Park on November 11th at 10 a.m. Do we have anybody here to present? Or no?
I don't believe so.
No,
Okay.
no, this is
You
pretty
can- sure.
explicit, yeah, so it's, again, it's November 11th, and it's a very important day in our history, and to, you know, remember our veterans. So it's, usually goes 11, 11, 11, meaning, but it starts, the parade starts at 10 a.m., corner of First and Main, and the parade will proceed up Main Street to Green Street, should have an E on the end, of Green, and to Patriots Memorial Park. So they do a great job, and we hope that people come, especially this year where so many of our veterans are still feeling, you know, disappointed in the recent current events, especially in getting everybody out of, you know, so I think it would be great to show them that how much we really do care about them and their service to this country. So it's a good event.
And we did not have it last year, correct? We didn't,
Virtual.
no, we didn't have it
Oh,
last
it was
year.
virtual, yeah.
It was all virtual, that's right.
Yeah, thank you for
So-
remembering
This
that.
will be the first parade that we've had.
Yeah, since COVID, yeah.
It's not jinx it, though.
Let's hope it doesn't rain.
I shouldn't have
I
said
know,
that.
right?
We'll march in the rain anyways.
That's right, that's right. Excellent, so November 11th at 10 a.m. I will entertain a motion to.
I move that the select board approve the request of the Patriotic Observance Committee to close the end of First Street at Main Street and conduct a Veterans Day Parade down Main Street to Patriots Memorial Park on November 11th, 2021 at 10 o'clock a.m.
A motion
Second?
and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Excellent. 5-0. We will see you all on the 11th. And now I will move it over to our volunteer subcommittee to walk us through the new appointments. Go ahead.
Okay. So first on the list is Ron Rudis for the Historical Commission. Ron is a lifelong North Andover resident and has recently retired from his job, so he's got some time that he wants to give back to the town. So he is looking to be appointed to the Historical Commission. And then we got Dr. Harry Cowell, I'm going to butcher his last name, Galushian. He is a retired physician and is very passionate about getting on the Council on Aging. He's himself is 93 years old. You would never know it. When we interviewed him, I was shocked when he told me that.
That's fantastic.
But he is very interested and very passionate about getting on the Council on Aging. And then we got Luke Michelle, who's here tonight, who wants to kind of start dipping his toes in the water a little bit gently and become an associate member on the Council on Aging. So, yeah, three very good and worthy folks that we would like to get appointed to those committees.
Madam Chair, I would move approval of our volunteers, and thank you all for volunteering. This is important work.
I'll second.
Should we
yeah, we
read
have to say it.
the date, the terms into the record?
Do you want me to do it? I can do it.
Yeah, thank you.
I move that the select board appoint Ron Rudis to the Historical Commission through June 30th, 2024, Harold Kalusian to the Council on Aging through June 30th, 2022, and Lucius Michelle as an associate member to the Council on Aging through June 30th, 2023.
I'll second that.
Motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Excellent. Welcome. Our town does not run without the volunteers. So we really thank you for your service and stepping up and volunteering. So, thank you very much. And then we will move on to our consent items. We only have one tonight on the agenda, and that's a donation in the amount of $100 from Smart Start, and that will be used for the purchase of equipment for the fire department. So I will entertain a motion to accept that.
Madam Chair, I move the Select Board accept the donation to the Fire Department from Smart Start LLC in the amount of $100, and that we follow that up with a letter of gratitude to them.
Second.
Motion, second. All those in favor? Aye. Again, thank you to Smart Start for that donation, much appreciated. And I will move on to the approval of our minutes from the October 12th meeting. Does anybody have any comments or adjustments?
Madam Chair, I
take a
move
motion.
approval.
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Okay. I'll accept those motions. We don't have any old business. Madam Town Manager, do you have any thing to add?
I sure do. I have a nice list here. So my first item is that we have Wendy Smith with us tonight. Wendy is from the Cultural Commission, and she wanted us to inform you. And do you mind if I invite her up to okay, in case she wants to add? Wendy, do you want to come up? Okay, but I'm going to start when you walk up. So Wendy's going to be hosting an evening at the Casino Royale, and it's going to be benefiting our Cultural Commission here in town, which is very exciting, so that they can do more grants. It's going to be at the North Andover Country Club. She's expecting between 70 and 80 people. It's going to be $120, right? And it's James Bond themed. And so it will be past hors d'oeuvres and a cash bar and live music and all kinds of casino games. And all of the money that they raise is going to be coming back to North Andover as part of the Cultural Council. So interestingly, they don't need any permission. They're allowed, but she wanted to make sure we all knew about it, we're so excited and thankful because it's amazing, and she's put so much work into it. But the Cultural Council is uniquely allowed by law to raise funds and do fundraising. So we're pretty excited that she's brought this forward.
And what better way than gambling?
No, you have not, because when I asked about it, Lynn Savage was so nice. She came in and she's like, in my 21 years of being here, no one's ever done any fundraising. She's like, we got to look into it.
Yeah.
So her and Suzanne did a lot of work.
Yeah.
I really want to thank them. Just on the record, they looked into a lot of the things. We had to kind of go to the state for the Lottery Commission, ask a lot of that. Are there any things that we need to do, particular guidelines that we need to follow so that it won't be considered through the Lottery Commission or gambling or anything like that. So a lot of the guidelines we worked through and talked through so that we'll be able to do that without any sort of tax implications or anything that we have to report back.
Good for you.
Thank you so much.
It's amazing, right?
Fantastic.
And what's the date?
December 11th, Saturday, December 11th. I will send my contact information. I actually am not doing advertising, oddly enough, because there are so many people already that want to go. I'm really doing it on a small scale because I want to test it. I'd like to start doing some annual type of things, maybe something like this, something for the Kentucky Derby, and maybe something in the summer like a cornhole tournament, things like that. But since it's a little new in this area, I kind of wanted to test it. So the North Andover Country Club is a start. I've talked to the Stevens Estates, Molac Farms, and other things, like I said, if this goes well.
That's fantastic. Good for you.
There you go.
Thanks,
Any
Wendy.
other questions?
Nope, we just wanted to let you know we're so excited, so we're very excited. Thank you, Wendy.
You
And
got
thank you
it.
for
Thank
waiting
you
all
so
this time.
much.
I know, what a
Here all night.
Yeah, isn't that exciting? I've got a few other things. So as we know, but we want everyone else to know, we have moved forward with the demolition on the senior center site. We're very excited.
You think?
Yep, those buildings are gone. For the neighbors who are concerned, there will be additional trees planted for buffering because, we had to take all the trees down in order to do the site work. Unfortunately, they weren't really trees. They were more like large shrubs. Yeah, but we will be coming in, and if you have any questions about the landscaping plan, there is availability of that right on our website.
Can I just make one comment?
Yeah.
We don't want to wait 20 years
No.
to see these trees.
Yeah.
So
There's
I
a
would-
nice landscaping plan. I can send it to you.
And with
Rosemary.
some really healthy, good size
We're very
shrubs that
Yes. we want to make sure we
There is
give
a
butter
brand of
stuff.
arborvitae that grows very quickly and very tall, so that would be,
I actually spoke to one of the neighbors today, and we were like, don't worry, you're getting trees again. We're going to make sure it's all there. But that we're really excited about that moving forward. We do have all the funding in place now, thanks to the Finance Committee. And so we have all the contracts signed, all the change orders ready to go from COVID, and we should be seeing a lot of action. You'll know when the trailer, the construction trailer shows up that it's real. So
Ready to go.
the transition to the Stevens Estate to Fireside Catering went very smooth on Friday. They actually had a wedding Friday night and Saturday night, and had no issues or concerns. I said they hired, I think, almost all, if not all, of our part-time staff. And Humira is over there with them as well. Laurie and I got super excited when they called to find out where they should send their rent check. I was like, woohoo! So, you know,
you don't want to be late with that
no,
first
we
one.
don't. So it's been smooth sailing on that. Laurie and I have been attending all of the Facilities Master 2 school capacity presentations, although we did not at the one tonight at Kittredge. We'll be at middle school tomorrow. We do have a website now live for Facilities Master Plan 2. It's right at the top of our website. You can go and check it out. There is another forum tomorrow at middle school, and then they will be here with us. And they're also going to be at the youth center and the senior center over the next few months. We did hear back from the airport, from the letter that we sent them after our last meeting. They have had a commission meeting since then, and are happy to work with us to address issues of the noise impacts on the community. They have started to immediately log all their noise complaints that they receive. And they've asked us to share the complaints that we've received, so we worked on that today. They're reaching out to the New England Region FAA compliance officer to inquire of the restrictions, if any. And they're going to be meeting again on the November 18th agenda for an update and any further action. So I anticipate that we'll hear from them soon. And then just one last final thing I promise is just a quick COVID update. We do have 70 active cases as of Thursday. And the data is a little interesting. So of the 70, 20 of them were vaccinated and 50 were not vaccinated. But of the 50 not vaccinated, 23 of them were under 11 years old. Yeah. So, it's interesting to see really the way that the data has changed. If we look back this time last year, we're focused more on the 50 to 74 range. The 50 to 74 range now, we had 11 people who were between 50 and 64, and only 5 between 65 and 74, and 3, 75 and up. And that's really where our cases would have been if you looked back. So it's an interesting trend change, something that obviously we're closely watching, but we do have 10 more cases than we had last week.
Let me ask you, so say it's a Delta variant, how does that register on the caseload? Is it distinguished any differently, or
So-
can they do that? I have no idea.
They're doing what they're doing basically is they're testing certain tests to get a percentage, and then they're basically telling us that a percentage of those cases are Delta. So they're doing like pool testing of the actual positive cases. So we don't really know who's Delta and who's not Delta. At one point on a call we were on a couple weeks ago, they basically said at this point assume everyone's Delta, which is kind of how we've been handling it.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
they just,
So.
well, especially if they've already been double vaccinated and they came down with it again.
Yes.
Even though statistically you can be double vaccinated and still get it. I mean, it's not 100%.
Right.
But they're making an educated guess that it is probably Delta.
Based on the
symptoms.
based on the pools they're doing.
Pool testing.
So if
They're
they do,
testing, we all get tested, they'll take them, right, and test them again.
Yeah.
And decide what strain it is.
Interesting.
although
the
out
state
of 10
level.
tests, they might only take one,
Right.
right? And then that's how they figure out the percentages. So it is interesting. The numbers are trending downwards across the region, so it's interesting that ours went up. We actually, right now, don't have any cases, 0, associated with higher education or congregate living. So, it's a complete change from what we were looking at not that long ago. We did do, through Greater Lawrence, because they're amazing, we did a high school clinic and a middle school clinic at the beginning of the month. So.
I have to say, because I was probably one of the ones who pushed back the most, so that's very good news about the higher education and congregate living.
It is.
I mean, that's a complete turnaround.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so Merrimack is clean.
Yeah.
No issues at all.
It was 0.
That's good.
The most we've had from them is like I think at one point, right when they went back, when they first did their first initial testing, we had 5. But it's really been very level, so.
And they're not allowing anybody on campus that's not vaccinated?
They're not.
Well, that's really good news, so I'm pleased to hear that.
Me too. So.
Have you heard any updates about when the 5 to 11 vaccine, we hear like rumblings of November, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've been hearing the beginning of November. I mean, it's a great point. All 3 vaccines are now approved for a booster shot. So, you know, I think that is a great thing and something that we'll be seeing, I think, more of. For the 5 to 11, we've been hearing the beginning of November. I told you, it's going to be like Black Friday. I'm going to be waiting at the door when it opens. It's very exciting. So, you know, we're all looking forward to that for sure. So, and at that point, we'll look to have a clinic as well for the kids. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. That's all I have, I promise.
Any selectmen updates? No?
Just one. So we got a text from National Grid saying that it's expected to have heavy winds and strong winds, heavy rains and strong winds Tuesday and Wednesdays. So stay connected and be prepared. Could lose power. Well, we're notorious for losing power, so make sure you get out and get the bread and milk.
I know, we'll come knock on your door. And I just wanted to thank the merchants for doing the window painting. My boys did theirs on Saturday morning, and they had a lot of fun, so, and I know there's pictures up, and so everybody can go visit our local merchants and see some Halloween paintings and stuff, which is great. So that was awesome, yeah. How many, do you know how many windows? 35 windows.
I think so. Take a drive around town and try to find them.
Find them all. Halloween obviously is Sunday from 5 to 7, is that?
5:30 to 7:30?
I think it's 5 to 7.
5 to 7?
5 to 7.
Probably
yeah.
because it's Sunday, they don't have to rush home from work.
Which is nice, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. That's, so our next meeting is November 8th, and like our town manager mentioned, the schools will be here presenting their plans for Facilities Master Plan 2, so that will be good for everybody to get more information on that. I believe we're going to try and do a joint meeting with the school board at that meeting, so we can have a discussion. And that's it. So our next meeting, November 8th, in this room, and I will take a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second. All those in favor? Aye. All right. Done.